There's been quite a lot of conversations of late, just how things are changing so dramatically right now. What that means for us as Christian believers, having to negotiate and navigate some different landscapes than what we might have been used to. Well, Bill Muehlenberg, Christian cultural commentator, has been writing about these sorts of things this past week, a number of articles, in fact, which he has called Seeking the Peace of the City, and reflecting on some words from the prophet Jeremiah about the children of Israel who were taken into exile and they found themselves in Babylon. Bill is back with us today. Hey, Bill, welcome back to 2020.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Bill, your inspiration for writing about this type of topic, seeking the peace of the city, and there's a few other titles you've got in there, but are really about how you negotiate a way forward when things are a little more hostile than they've ever been.
Yeah, that's right. As is often the case, what I end up writing about on my website comes out of my daily reading of Scripture. So obviously, at the moment, I'm in the book of Jeremiah, and there's heaps there. I've, as you say, written a bunch of articles now looking at various themes, but of course, a big one for Jeremiah was judgment is coming. The people of God are, well, you're toast, basically. You've lived so long in sin, disobedience, and rebellion and idolatry that judgment must come. So he told them ahead of time. He promised. He said it's going to happen. God also said they won't listen to you, but do it anyway. So that's a lesson for us today. We got to preach the gospel in Melbourne, in Paris, in Rome. You'll get probably the same kind of response. But Jeremiah 29:7, a famous passage, especially, ended up, I think, 2 or 3 articles I've done just on this one passage, which says, "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in the welfare, its welfare, you will find your welfare." Now, just think to the Jew listening at the time, right? They thought, I'm God's people. We're great. Babylon is a horrible, pagan, bloodthirsty, evil empire. And here's Jeremiah, God's prophet, saying, pray for Babylon. In fact, you're going to be there. You're going to be there a long time. Pray for it. Seek its peace, its shalom, its welfare. And as you seek its blessing, God can in turn bless you. It's a way, certainly Israel wouldn't have thought of things, and I suspect a lot of Christians today, looking at the pagan cities that we live in, it's a different way of looking at things.
What about this word exile, Bill? Because there are some who are saying Australia was very Christian friendly because of a wonderful heritage that gave us so many Christian principles. Some of those things are changing now. This word exile, does it have any meaning for us as we feel as though there's some pressure coming on? Things are different to the way that they were, and perhaps some might feel as though Christians are now a little bit in exile themselves.
Yeah, well, absolutely, as I negotiate a cat jumping in front of me. The New Testament picks up that theme, so this is not just some Old Testament idea. It's, Peter and others, for example, talk about how we, in effect, are living in exile as well. So we can certainly get lessons, and certainly, as you say, the same kind of thing. We had very much a Christian heritage for quite a while, but now we've squandered it. We're about as bad as ancient Israel. We had such a great run there for a long time here in the West, but now we're about as pagan as Israel had become. So we can ask the same kind of questions. Is God maybe thinking of judging Australia, America, New Zealand, England, and so on? And if so, how do we respond to that scenario? Now, as I keep pointing out in these pieces, God did have a prophetic voice back then, an inspired voice, which became the canon of Scripture. So he could say, look, don't resist. You're going to be there 70 years, like it or not. So that's your fate. Today, we don't have that same inspired sort of prophetic word, so we can only take general principles, right? So what would happen if, say, Indonesia decided to invade Australia? Could we say, well, God is saying, don't resist, just submit and be willing to be carried off to Indonesia? Well, again, we don't have that specific word, so we can maybe at best take principles. What do you do when you have enemies? You can pray for them, as Jesus said, but does that mean we can never resist? All kinds of big questions, right, arise here. I would think if China or somebody did invade Australia, we would have every right to defend ourselves and so on, and not necessarily see it as God's hand, although he may well use a communist China or a Muslim Indonesia. So just things to at least think about how we apply what happened to Israel to some of our situations today.
And what happened to Israel, if we're comparing ourselves, there is a sense, isn't there, in which the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, thinking of, Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, well, they didn't take up arms to fight those who might be oppressing them. They were able to use whatever other means, influence and even the political reform processes to be able to make their presence felt. And they didn't take up violence, and in so doing, they sort of reaped peace on themselves. Is that a way of thinking about how they might have reacted?
Well, it certainly was. And again, we have to be careful in terms of how do we apply this today. As I just mentioned, there is a place for individual self-defense. I think a nation to defend itself, right, from outside aggression. The Allies were right to resist Hitler and the Nazis. So we're not saying, right, we can never take up use of force, certainly governments and armies, if there is a oppressive tyrant out to get you. But as we say in this case, they were told quite clearly, do not resist Babylon. Do not put up a fight. If you surrender, some of you will be taken into captivity, but you will live. If you don't surrender, you will meet with the sword, and that's exactly what happened. So there again, a specific set of prophetic words to a particular people at a certain time. But as they were called to be exiles for 70 years, as you say, people like Daniel and others had a real impact while they were there. So again, we can at least look at the bigger, broader picture. What do we do? Melbourne, Brisbane, London, Paris, they're pretty much pagan, secular cities. You could talk about the church really in the West being in its own Babylon captivity. So how do we respond, or what do we do? What does it mean to pray for the peace and the welfare of Brisbane or Perth or Chicago or Los Angeles, right? So those are some of the things we can at least think about. And it can become practical things as well, how we might reach out to a city. And of course, today, most people live in cities. So while you and I may, if we had the choice, right, move out to the bush, get a nice little self-sustaining farm somewhere, grow your own veggies, have some chicks and sheep, cattle, whatever, that would be nice. But for most of us, it's not quite an option. So what does it mean to live in a big pagan secular city?
And it's not the only time, this reflection on Jeremiah, because while the Israelites were taken into captivity, into exile, other times when you're reflecting too on some great Christian thinkers like Saint Augustine, and who wrote the work The City of God, whereas the City of God and the City of Man, and how do they get on together, the differences there. And that's an historic view, isn't it? It goes back to the Roman Empire and the way that Christians suffered. Thoughts here on other times in history where these same sorts of thoughts are very meaningful for how you navigate a way forward. Yeah,
right. Great Christian thinkers did often consider how all this works out. As you mentioned, Augustine and his famous book. I mean, Scripture often uses Babylon as kind of a symbol, a representative figure of, evil man, fallen man, sinful man. And so even in, Book of Revelation, going all the way to end times, you read about Mystery Babylon and how Babylon has fallen. So again, the same themes. We have the city of God, which is God and his people, today the church. And we have the city of man. So that is, well, it was ancient Babylon. It was the Roman Empire, Nazi Germany, communist China, North Korea, even secular pagan Australia. In a sense, all these are part of the city of man. They're part of the old Babylonian system. So once again, how do we respond? How do we have an impact? This struggle will be with us until the end of time. Some say we should opt out completely, right? Have nothing to do with this world. But Jesus seems to say something different. We are to be salt and light. We are to have an impact. So we could give examples of, even today, how we have an impact in a city which is largely hostile to the church, or at least indifferent to it.
And so as we remember those sorts of influences, whether it's Jeremiah and the children of Israel, or whether it's St. Augustine and Christians and the Romans, you've got captives. And we might think of ourselves as at a time when things are deteriorating, things are getting a little bit tougher. I know you reflect, Bill, on the temptation to run away and hide. But you also then draw attention to the thought that even as the Israelites did, or even as the Christians did in the Roman Empire, they made themselves at home. Is this part of, you think, this understanding of the peace of the city, making yourself at home, but maintaining your faithfulness to God?
Yeah, again, I think that's part of it, and that'll be expressed in so many different ways, right? It might just mean keeping your own property tidy, keeping the trees trimmed, and maybe helping a neighbor mow their lawn, helping out in a soup kitchen, or any number of charitable works. It has all kinds of expressions as to how we can be of help in a city. Sure, today it's governments and bureaucracies and the welfare state that have taken over so much of this, but historically it always was the church and small volunteer groups that were doing a lot of these goods in the city. And you think of, Booth, right, in the Salvation Army, Spurgeon, Wilberforce, so many people in England who had such an impact in a big city like London. So the same today, we have a role to play. Again, some want to flee and have nothing to do with the city and what the secular world is all about. But, again, that principle, how do we seek the welfare of the city? And let me give, just one practical example from a while back. Some of your listeners will recall the ministry Salt Shakers, right? Peter and Jenny Stokes, they used to appear on your show.
They were regulars on this program.
They were. And, when they were active, and I was a founding member of Salt Shakers, Peter used to be a bus driver, right? So once in a while we would rent out a bus, fill it with Christians, and, maybe on a Friday night, drive into the city. Peter would drive it in. We'd get out, say, at Parliament House or at a casino, maybe even a brothel, an abortion clinic, right? We'd have 40, 60 people going up, laying hands on Parliament House, asking for God's blessing, asking for, the powers of darkness to be broken. So spiritual warfare, intercession, just praying down the strongholds in the city. Or we might even go up in the surrounding hills where we knew there were, New Age shops, witches' covens, even pray for the schools, whatever. So this kind of practical prayer, just going on a prayer walk around your block, get a few Christian friends, walk around the blocks, pray for the schools there, the shops. So this is, I would think, a small but important part of what it is to seek the welfare of the city. And again, that famous passage has the word that I have sent you to. So that's interesting. God put ancient Israel in pagan Babylon. So in a sense, you could say us Christians have been put by God in pagan Brisbane, pagan Sydney. So what are we going to do with the time that we're here? How are we going to be this salt and light and be this blessing to a very needy city?
It might be inspiration, Bill, to arrive on time for your local church prayer meeting. And if it's just doing ordinary things, maybe shake it up, because what we're hearing today is that the influence that we have in the city is not only social, not only political, but it is also spiritual. And that challenging way of being spiritual, being a person of prayer, and being a person who will unite others to understand what it is to seek the peace of the city before God. For listeners who might like to read this latest article and a number that have sprung from this type of theme, the one we're talking about today is called Seeking the Peace of the City. You can find it at billmuehlenberg.com or simply Google Culture Watch, one word. Bill, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.